Hi, Gered. Thank you for coming on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for asking me.
No worries. Thank you. So you've got a Rolling Stones book coming out next month, um, with rare and with rare and unseen images.
Yeah,
Can you tell us more about that book, please?
I can. I can even show it to you. Can I do that? Look,
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
beautiful looking book, isn't it?
yeah, it looks nice. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm very pleased with it. Yeah, so I've had several Rolling Stones books published over the years, and to be honest, I thought I'd probably done it. I thought I've covered that. But my publisher, Welbeck Publishing, who a few years back published a retrospective book for me, asked me if I could do a Rolling Stones book. And I thought, oh, I'm not sure whether I really want to just revisit all the stuff. And they said, have you got unpublished? And I thought, well, yeah, I've got a lot of unpublished stuff, but I think there's a reason for it having not been published before, that it's not that the best has floated to the top, and that's what we've always used. And they persuaded me to have a look, and I started going through the archive from A to Z, and I began to really get into it. It was really quite an uplifting experience because I guess I started looking at things with a more of an editorial eye. And I started seeing pictures that had been completely passed over previously, not because there was anything fundamentally wrong with them, but perhaps another picture from the same sequence or the same moment, the same concert, the same recording session, had just somehow come up to the top of the bottle. And that's the one we went with, and we never looked further. And I began to uncover pictures that I thought, these are bloody good. And I got into it, and I put together a huge selection. I think I found perhaps 250 pictures that hadn't been published or widely seen. And that's been edited down, and out of that has come this beautiful new book.
yeah. What are some photos in the books that you can tell stories about, or anything you can say, really?
Well, it basically it's basically my career with the Stones. So my career with the Stones started in 65, early 65. I did my first session with the band. And out of that session came the album cover for an album called Out of Our Heads, which was called December's Children in America, for any of your American listeners. And that was a huge success for me, to shoot a session without an album sleeve being a primary objective, but always in the back of my mind, the desire to have a Rolling Stones record cover would have been, fantastic. So when Andrew Loog Oldham, who was their manager and producer at the time, decided that this particular shot would make the cover, I was absolutely overwhelmed. And that was the beginning. And the session was just a huge success. And then I went on working with them in 65. And then in the late summer of 65, they asked me to go on tour with them in America. So all of this is covered in the book. And I went and did the autumn 65 tour of America, which was massive. I mean, something like 36 cities, I think, 60 odd concerts, and all over the States. And it went from October until December. I think we were actually touring for 6 weeks, and then they went straight into the recording studio, and that's all covered. And then into 66, I shot more stuff with them, and we had more record cover experiences. I did all the pictures for Got Live If You Want It were mine. And then in 66, I shot the cover for an album called Between the Buttons, which is probably the most well-known of my Stones covers. And that was released in 67. And in 67, I covered recording sessions and then there was this big explosive bust up between the band and Andrew. And by that time, I was very much in Andrew's camp as opposed to the Stones camp. And so that was the end for me as well. And I continued to work for Andrew, and he remains, you know, one of my closest friends today.
Was it through Andrew you got to work with the Rolling Stones after he saw you Marianne Faithfull images?
It was, and well researched, yes. So I'd met Marianne in '64 when she was promoting As Tears Go By, her first record. And I was introduced to her by another of my really old friends, Jeremy Clyde, who was part of a duo called Chad and Jeremy, who were also having some chart success at that time. And he'd met Marianne at a recording session for, I think, Top of the Pops or Thank Your Lucky Stars, I think it was, which was a ITV show from Birmingham. And I met Marianne and just thought she was absolutely beautiful and funny and charming, and I really fell for her in a big way and asked her if I could take some photographs of her, and she was instantly agreeable, and I whisked her off and we started working together without me knowing anything about Andrew, really. I mean, I knew of Andrew's existence, but I wasn't working with him or meeting him at this point because the Marianne's day-to-day management was handled by other people. And I was just photographing Marianne because I thought she was beautiful and a great subject. I didn't really have a big commercial vision, but as I got to know her and I started photographing her in the recording studio, and then I had an idea for her first album cover and I shot that, and Andrew liked that, and that was, I think, the key, the link that brought me together with Andrew. And then he asked me to work with the Stones.
What was your experience like going on tour with the Stones in 1965?
Well, it was a multifaceted experience. It was a lot of different things. First off, it was incredibly exciting. I mean, I wasn't very experienced at shooting live band pictures. I'd done a little bit of touring with a band called the John Barry Seven, but that was, you know, very amateur, very low key, all piled into the drummer's car, up in the Midlands somewhere. I don't really remember much more about it than that. So when the Stones asked me to go on tour, it was a huge thing because it would be my first trip to America. It was with the Rolling Stones, who by that time were firmly established as second only to the Beatles. They'd had the hit with Satisfaction, which they hadn't had when I first started working with them. And it was that hit, that record, Satisfaction, that consolidated their position as the #2 British rock band. And so to be going on tour with them, that was exciting. To travel to America first class on TWA, that was exciting. So it was all very exciting. Arriving in New York was exciting, you know, with Cadillac limos on the tarmac and being whisked through and girls screaming and everything. Arriving at the hotel was quite extraordinary because it was absolutely inundated with fans, all of whom managed to get onto the roof of the limo. And we were holding the roof up. The roof was actually bowing, and we were holding the roof up, shouting at the driver to drive, and he wouldn't drive because the kids were all in front of the car and the police weren't doing anything. Finally, the police managed to part a path down to the underground car park, and we escaped. But, you know, so that beginning, that first few hours was just absolutely mind-blowing. The first few days in New York were very exciting. The first concerts were absolutely phenomenal. And then it got into a sort of, I wouldn't want to say a rut, but it got into a really exhausting routine. And I'll explain why. It was the first tour they did with their own plane, their own hired plane. And because of costs and everything, it was decided that after each concert, the band would fly out to the next gig. And so we'd be flying in the night, through the night. So we'd leave the concert at whatever it was, 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock, be on the plane by midnight, take off, arrive somewhere at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning that would be dead, deserted, closed, couldn't see where we were. We'd be whisked to a motel, designated our rooms, and that was it. And then we'd wake up the next day for lunch, and we'd have lunch at a hamburger joint or something, and then we'd be whisked off to the concert, and the thing would start again. Now, it was okay. It was quite exciting, quite fun for the first few days. But then the routine, this routine of working, of flying through the night, not getting up until lunchtime, was really draining. And week after week, it was quite exhausting, and not really a huge amount of fun. I mean, you know, if you arrive at 4 o'clock in the morning in some sort of Nowheresville, Indiana, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to eat, you can't go and have a drink, there are no fans around, there's nothing, you know, there's nothing. So, you know, you really are chucked into deserted middle America. And that wasn't really a great deal of fun. And it was always agreed that I would only photograph backstage and on stage. They didn't want me to impose myself, you know, on them in their hotel rooms. I didn't take photograph on the plane. That was all considered to be downtime and not to be photographed. I was quite happy at that moment not to photograph it. I mean, with hindsight, I wish I had photographed it. It would have put together a much more comprehensive picture story. But hey, you know, that's what everybody wanted, so that's what I did.
One of my favourite Rolling Stones photos that he did is the one of Brian Jones, when he's got his back to the camera and there's a light shining on him. And it's kind of eerie now looking back what happened the next few years, but what was he like?
Well, that picture, that particular shot, I call the spirit. Because it's a really beautiful picture, and Brian looks wonderful, and he's semi-silhouetted, and there's this great long shaft spotlight on him. Brian was he was a mixed bag of emotions, and could be very, very lovely to deal with, very charming, really quite sophisticated, well-educated, a lovely person to be with. And then he could be really unpleasant to be with, and dangerous, edgy, difficult. You just didn't quite know where you were with him. And it was clearly, I mean, I don't think anybody understood what his issues or problems were at the time, but clearly he had mental health issues. Whether he was undiagnosed bipolar or whatever, I don't know. Of course, I don't know. But he was very up and down, and so if you got him on a down point, it was really difficult. He could be very tricky, and then the next minute he could be very funny. And of course, he was a hugely talented musician, and you know, could play almost any instrument that he picked up. He could make music with it, which was remarkable. But he was a very difficult character, and you know, for me, there's no two ways about it. He just was a very difficult character.
Did you prefer shooting the band together or individually? Because in 1966 you did the photos of them at their homes.
Yes, that's a good question, actually. I think that as a band, initially, I didn't think about photographing them other than as a band. I mean, it didn't feel right. You know, the Rolling Stones were a band. They were a group of 5 blokes, all of whom, by the time I started working with them, had a different look. Each one had a slightly different look, slightly different style, which was part of their vision and image and strength. I think by the time I got to know them, which I guess really happened on tour, on that tour, I began to get to know them individually. I had very good relationships with all of them, albeit the one with Brian was a bit dodgy sometimes, but I got on really well with them. And I think by that time, I'd also photographed them in the studio quite a lot. And in the recording studio, you do tend to photograph people individually or maybe in twos, but getting the group together in one shot in the recording studio is almost out of the question because of where they're positioned and the mechanics of the studio. So in a way, when we did the At Home series, which was in the summer of '66, I knew them really well, and it was just a great joy, you know, to go and hang out with them for a day in each of their homes and take pictures. That was just absolutely lovely thing to do. And I think also by that time, in the public's eye, they had established individual images, if you see what I mean. By the middle of '66, they were very much individual members of the band, if you see what I mean.
Whilst you're in America touring with the Rolling Stones, they were in the studio doing the Aftermath album. What was that like?
That was right at the end. So right at the end of the tour, the '65 tour, we had a few days break, and then they went into RCA Studios in Hollywood to record what would become the Aftermath album. And it was great. They knew the studio very well. They'd recorded there before. They had a great, very famous American engineer called Dave Hassinger, who was a big deal in those days. He was a really skilled professional recording engineer. And the studios had a great atmosphere. I mean, they were, you know, they were supposed to be extremely high quality, all of that stuff. Elvis Presley had recorded there, apparently. All the RCA artists had recorded there. So that was exciting. The lighting was pretty good. And I was able to shoot pretty much as I wanted. We were so close by then, having been on the road, and I was so much part of the gang, if you like, that I was just one of the band to all intents and purposes. Everybody treated me like that. There was, and I knew instinctively when to back off, you know, when to go into the control room when they were. So it was great. It was lovely. And I think I was only in the recording studios for about 2 or 3 days because I sort of basically got a set of pictures of them recording, and that's what Andrew wanted. And then I headed home to spend Christmas with my family.
Yeah. Is it okay if I name some bands and artists you've worked with, and you tell us any stories or your experience working with them?
Yeah, well, I'll try and remember. It's such a long list that I need some prompting. So in the '60s, I was working for Andrew Oldham a lot, not just with the Stones, but with all his artists on the Immediate Record Company, which he started in '65 as well. So I was shooting artists like the Small Faces, Amen Corner, P.P. Arnold, The Nice, Vashti Bunyan, and others. And I was sort of, I was designing some things, I was art directing some things, I was doing adverts. It was a very creative, exciting period. The '60s were great for me. I had a great '60s. And then in '67, I started working with Jimi Hendrix. I knew Chaz Chandler, who was the bass player in a group called The Animals, and who was going into management and production at that time. And he brought Jimmy over from America. And at the end of 66, they arrived, I think, in around October, early November. And Chaz put on a sort of little tryout gigs at a seedy club in Soho called the Bag of Nails. And he rang me and he said, I've got this fantastic new artist who I want you to work with. Come to the Bag of Nails tonight and see him. And so I went to the Bag of Nails and was just kind of blown away by not really so much Jimi's music, which, to be honest, and I've said this before, it went over my head initially, but by him. His look and his charisma was just overwhelming. It was like a bomb went off in the room. And he was very quiet and sweet and humble when Chaz introduced me. And we agreed that he'd come to the studio. And unfortunately, that didn't happen for a while because, well, they got him working. They sent him off to Europe with the experience to tighten up, to write more material, to get an act together. And then I didn't actually start photographing him until early 67.
With somebody like that that's got that like character, is it easier to shoot them in a way?
Well, that's also a good question, because the reality is that almost everybody at that point in time didn't really like having their picture taken. They didn't really like the idea that they had to pose for pictures. And a lot of them didn't even completely comprehend that it was a really important part of the music business. You know, a lot of musicians just want to play their music. They don't really want to deal with all the other shit that goes around it. And having your photograph taken is an important part of creating an image and consolidating an image and making an image stick. And that's how I saw myself. I saw myself as an image maker, and that's what I wanted to be. So a big part of the job was to try and make people feel comfortable about having their photograph taken. And, people compared going to the photographer as to going to the dentist, which always struck me as being terribly insulting to the photographer. But that was it. I mean, the Stones were pretty comfortable with the camera from the beginning, but they became much better and easier going. Jimi was quite apprehensive because he'd only really ever been photographed as part of a band, and then perhaps not a very highly considered part of the band. And that's no reflection on his talent. It's just that in the bands that he was in, he was very much a backline player. And so, and treated as such. So in photographs, he would have been a sort of supporting player. So suddenly he's right at the front of it. And he was a great subject, but he did need a sort of some reassuring. And I think that a great deal of what I used to do was to try and explain what I was trying to do. Because remember, we didn't have Polaroid. We're talking about analog film chemistry. We didn't have any way of showing the subject what you were doing. I mean, everybody wanted to look through the camera at their mates or at other members of the band and laugh or make comments, but nobody could see what I was doing, and nobody could see what the lighting was actually going to be. So they had to trust me. And that trust, establishing that trust, being on their side, holding their hand sort of thing, was a big part of the job. And it was a part of the job that I understood from the very outset. I'm not sure why particularly, but I understood that. And I felt tremendous empathy with my subjects, and I was able to make them feel good in front of the camera, and I was able to communicate with them what I was trying to do and get them on side. You know, you can't take good photographs in spite of the subject. You know, I mean, models are very beautiful, slender women usually, because that's what photographs so well. It's not an accident. You know, that's what photographs so well. So when you've got a band of regular, albeit extremely talented people, but people who aren't particularly confident in how they look or what they're wearing, you need to help them and guide them. And in those days, before Polaroid, before we could share what we were doing, that was a huge part of the job. And so that dictated how the sessions progressed. I used to feed everybody, and that would give us all an opportunity to break the ice, for me to see people, so I could pick up on if somebody had a funny blinking thing, or, you know, I could look at people when we were eating. It gave me an opportunity to you know, just make some decisions about where I was going to pose them and how I was going to bring them together. And you know, that was how it was really, until Polaroid came in, which I think was probably in the very late 60s or early 70s. I can't actually remember.
When you were going into a shoot with these artists and bands, did you have it set in your mind what you wanted to do, or would you play around a bit once you were in there?
Well, I think there was a certain amount of playing around, but I learned very quickly that I had to have an idea of what I wanted. And I used to shoot in that early-ish period in the mid-60s. I used to always shoot inside my studio. That's where we'd start. That's where people would arrive. We'd have coffee. I'd give them some food. We'd talk a little bit. And then I'd ease them into the whole process of having their pictures taken. And then usually, not every time, not with Jimmy actually, but with most of the bands, we'd also go outside and shoot some in the area around my studio. And that's how I came to shoot the Rolling Stones, the first album, which is outside the studio. But I sort of realized that if there was going to be a lot of playing around, then there was a risk that you weren't going to get really great pictures. And I wanted to get really great pictures because, one, I wanted to make sure I got paid. Two, I wanted to make sure that the client, whether it was the band or whether the manager or whoever it was, the record company, that they got a really great session and wanted to use me again. So, you know, I was always a very commercial photographer, in the sense that this was how I earned my living. It wasn't a hobby. I had lots of fun doing it. I was a photographer because I had fun doing it, but I was very professional. I was trying to be very professional. So I learned early on that you have to have some discipline. You have to, otherwise, if the band is just fooling around, and there are some bands that's all they can do, but if they're just fooling around, then the chances are that very slim that you're going to get a great picture, because a great picture requires a little bit more input than just that. It can't, if you're relying entirely on chance, then the chances are you're not going to get it.
Yeah. What was the shoot like for George Harrison's Cloud 9 album?
Wow. Well, I mean, that was great. I knew George a little bit because I'd done quite a lot of work for Dark Horse Records, and which was his record company, and I'd met the Beatles quite a lot, very casually. I didn't know John at all. I don't remember meeting Ringo very often, but I met Paul and George quite a lot, and always got on really well with both of them. And by the time George came to the studio for the Cloud Nine, to be honest, we were expecting uh, him to arrive with a bit of a posse, you know. I mean, it was George Harrison. He was, you know, he was huge, you know. And we had this, we were going to do a series of pictures against painted clouds. I had a guy who painted the most beautiful cloud backgrounds. We had a couple of great cloud backgrounds set up. And then George arrived completely by himself. He'd driven by himself. He was carrying his clothes. He had his guitar. He was more concerned about where he could park than anything else. He was completely, he was lovely. I mean, I can't, it sounds such a cliche, but he was just so sweet. He was so nice to everybody. By that time, I didn't have a big team, but I had about 3 people at the studio working for me full time. So, you know, there were 5 of us, and he was just so sweet to everybody. We showed him what we'd set up. We gave him some food. We gave him lunch, and at lunch he had us in hysterics. He had us in hysterics, telling us incredibly filthy stories about the early days in Liverpool. And he was just such fun. And he was he was so patient, because I was shooting it all on a big format camera, a 5x4-inch camera, where, you know, you actually have the hood that you put over your head and you shoot one frame at a time. And so it's quite laborious and it's quite time consuming. And he was so patient and tolerant and creative with it. You know, he got the message. He knew exactly what we were trying to do, and he really made the session extra special. And it was very successful. I mean, we got the album sleeve, we got single bags, we got posters. One of my favorite pictures of all time is the picture against the blue sky with the white clouds and the big black guitar, the big black Gretsch guitar. And yeah, he was lovely. One of the great high points, whenever I get together with my old gang, my old studio gang, George is one of the shoots that everybody wants to remember and talk about.
Yeah, down to earth guy for how successful he was.
Yeah. He was, you know, he was just a very real, down to earth person. I mean, of course, you know, he was who he was. He was enormously wealthy. He was enormously talented. He was feted all around the world. But, you know, when it came to this session, he didn't feel he needed any support. He just came and was himself and worked hard. I mean, he was worked for about 7 or 8 hours, which is quite a long session. And you know, and he was great pleasure to be with, and a lovely man.
When you shoot an album cover, do the record label or the band or the manager tell you how they want it, or can you do it the way you want to do it?
It varies. Usually with what's called a conceptual album sleeve, i.e. a sleeve that's been thoroughly thought out by a designer and an art director. Normally they've worked hand in glove with the management and the artist, depending upon the status of the artist. And then they either bring me in right at the beginning, so I'm involved from the outset, so that, you know, designers don't come up with ideas that aren't practical. You know, sometimes you get people talking about, you know, it's going to be a beautiful day with sun and all the green fields, and you point out that we're in the middle of November. You know, really, sometimes it's as mundane as that. But it does vary, and other times I'm involved from the outset. So on the George Harrison album, for instance, the art director, designer, was a very close friend of mine called David Costa. And David and I had worked out the idea, and he talked to George. And so he knew, you know, George sort of knew what to expect. And then David and I had worked out the practicalities of how we were going to do it in advance. And then occasionally, as earlier on, as in the 60s, album sleeves would be made from photographs that had already been taken. They weren't conceptual. The manager or the record company would say, that picture would make a great cover. Let's put that on the cover. But by the 70s, really, by the early mid-70s, most of it was quite planned and worked out. Sometimes in tremendous depth and detail, sometimes just a sort of scribble on a page, depending upon how complicated it was.
The next artist I wanted to talk about was Kate Bush.
Ah, yes.
What was those shoots like?
Well, those shoots were absolutely fabulous. And when I first heard Wuthering Heights, I couldn't believe my ears. You know, it was so different and so unique and so special. And the rhythms were extraordinary, and melody was fantastic, and this voice and everything. I hadn't seen her at that point. I was just in a horrible little room in EMI Records in Manchester Square. And I said, well, can you play that again? I can't really believe my ears. And I realized that what we needed was a photograph that would also blow people's minds, that they would want to see it again. You want to hear the record again because you don't quite believe your ears. You want to see the picture again because you don't quite believe your eyes. And that was what was going on. And because of the importance of dance and movement to her, which was quite clear in talking with her early on, I came up with the idea of putting her in a leotard. I've always had a bit of a thing about dancers and their rehearsal clothes. I'd worked a lot in the theatre and a lot with the chorus, and I'd always loved watching dancers in rehearsal because they always looked somehow very individual and amazing, and they had their hair in bands and long socks over tights, and they had a great look, and I wanted that for Kate, and she seemed to like that idea. Everybody else did. And so that first shoot with the pink and green leotards was just amazing, because when she stepped out of the dressing room in the pink leotard, she blew us away. I mean, she just looked absolutely wonderful, quite beautiful, charismatic, magnetic. She just looked wonderful, and she responded terribly well to the camera. I mean, the camera loved her, and she understood how to work to the camera, and I was able to work really well with her. So that first shoot was absolutely mind-blowing, and then it was such a huge success, and she was such a huge success, that very quickly they got me to do another shoot, and which was primarily to replace the UK cover for Kick Inside, because the American EMI didn't want to use the British cover, and a lot of territories, foreign territories, didn't want to use the British cover. They didn't like it. They couldn't work with it. And so I came up with a very simple solution of building a box, a square box, putting her inside it and having her pose, again, using her skills as a mime, as a dancer, to create great shapes within this very limited box, and hence the Kick Inside. It was purely an illustration of the title, and she responded. She was a fantastic subject, and we loved working with Kate. And then we did Lionheart, which, although I know the album wasn't quite as successful as Kick Inside, and there's various criticism that it was a bit rushed or it was whatever, but it was a fantastic album and a beautiful cover, and we were absolutely thrilled with that cover. And we designed and art directed that as well. I had an assistant who was a graphics designer as well, called Richard Gray, and he designed the cover and did all the artwork. So we were heavily involved. And then we did another session in '79. I I think we did 1 or 2 sessions in '79. I get confused. And then we stopped working together. Richard, my assistant, Richard Gray, said that I'd encouraged her to go and work with other photographers. I'm not sure whether I was that stupid, but apparently he said he remembers quite clearly that I'd said something along those lines to her. But never, you know, I had 4 or 5 absolutely brilliant sessions with her, and that whole first year of her career was sort of, you know, my images, really. I mean, when she did the tour, the cover of the program for the tour was nearly entirely my pictures. All the posters, everything was my pictures of her. So yeah, it was a huge success for me, huge success for her, and yeah, it was you know, terrific. I mean, a really important artist for me. I'm very proud of the work that I did with Kate.
You mentioned there that your photos were on like the programs and stuff. And I've seen on your Instagram at like award shows and stuff like that, they still use your photos for bands and stuff. Are you proud of that? That your work's still recognised so far down the line?
Yes, I am. I think you're referencing Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in particular, who last year, when they gave Eurythmics,
yeah, that was the one, yeah,
the prize, when they used my portrait of them. Absolutely huge. I wish I'd been there. I would have loved to have seen it. And yes, I was absolutely delighted with that. The thing is that it's a funny thing, but I don't know whether it's imposter syndrome or a version of imposter syndrome, but when you're doing a job that you really love and you're apparently succeeding, there is always, and you're a freelance, you're self-employed, you've got no backup, you've got no real security, you're you know, everything on your shoulders. You do often look around and think, gosh, you know, is somebody going to come along and want to take this all away from me? You know, is it real? Can I actually get away with this for another year or another shoot or whatever it is? So all these years later, you know, when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame throw up my picture of Eurythmics to celebrate Eurythmics being inducted, it's a huge thing. It really excites me. And when I see you know, when I see my work going up in exhibitions or going up in whatever it is, restaurants or people's homes, you know, galleries send me photographs of a print that's gone up in a client's home. It really thrills me. I really get a huge kick out of it. And I'll tell you one other thing. Occasionally, it's only happened a couple of times, I've been walking down a London street and I've looked in a room, as you might do at night, and I've seen my picture on somebody's wall.
really.
And that is a complete mind blower. You think that is amazing. You know, you see the art that you created on some complete stranger, anonymous stranger's wall. That's really special.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah, really proud of that.
Yeah.
Another band I wanted to talk about, I think these are a bit more difficult to photograph, but Oasis.
Oh, yes. Well, Oasis shouldn't have. I mean, the Oasis session was for Mojo. It was for the cover of Mojo early on, 96 or something. And the band should have been really thrilled to be on the cover of Mojo. But for some reason, they were in the most appalling mood. And they were on the verge of going on a European tour off to Sweden or something like that. And they arrived and, the first thing I heard was a lot of noise, a lot of kicking and a lot of angry shouting. And then Noel stormed into the studio. I mean, really stormed, you know, like marching. And he looked at me. I've never, ever in my life had anybody look at me with such venom. It was amazing. It was, in cartoons, the daggers.
Yeah.
It was like daggers at me. And he just threw himself on a sofa that was in the corner of the studio and sort of rolled over with his back to everybody. I mean, it was an extraordinary, petulant, childlike bit of behavior. I mean, it was extraordinary, and it took my breath away because it was so funny and yet, alarming as well. And in the meantime, his brother was kicking the shit out of the kitchen, the studio kitchen, and shouting. And I heard him shout. He shouted to somebody. He shouted, "It's only a fucking photo session," And it was like, oh my God, what's going on here? And there was a young chap from the press department of the record company, and he was almost visibly shaking. He didn't know what to do. And he came up to me and he went, "I'm awfully sorry about this. I don't know what to do." I said, "Well, you better do something, because, we can't shoot with one of them apparently sleeping in the corner and the other one screaming and shouting in the kitchen. We're not going to get anywhere." And fortunately, the turning point was that their tour manager was a guy called Robbie, an ex-commando, very handsome, tall, big, muscly bloke. And I knew Robbie because he'd been on the Gary Moore tour that I had shot the earlier that year or the previous year for a live album with Gary Moore. And I got to know this guy, Robbie. And I said to Robbie, I said, "Is there anything you can do? Because otherwise, you might as well just take them away, because we're not going to get anything." And Robbie talked to them. He sort of dragged Noel into the kitchen, and I heard him, and we started shooting, and we had a great session. And the first Polaroid that they saw, they weren't friendly. I wouldn't, they weren't friendly, but they suddenly decided they were going to work with me. And when they saw the first Polaroid, I think they just agreed or recognized that I knew what I was doing, and that maybe, as Robbie had pointed out, the cover of Mojo was actually a jolly good thing for them to have, however rebellious and angry they wanted to be. And then they worked beautifully, and we did a great series of pictures. In fact, one of my portrait of Noel with a beautiful Gibson guitar is one of the prints that's going to be seen at the new Gibson Garage Gallery launch on the 24th of this month. And we got a great session. And I took them up to Primrose Hill, and where I did a sort of pastiche of Between the Buttons, of the Rolling Stones' Between the Buttons, which worked beautifully. And they were great. They were really good. And I can't say that we parted on good terms, because I don't remember them saying goodbye or thank you or anything. I don't remember any other interchange, except for the fact that we actually got a really good session. But it was an extraordinary, it was a real challenge. And if I hadn't known Robbie, and if he hadn't been, the intelligent managerial character that he was, we would never have got that session, which would have been a great loss for me anyway.
Were them shoots both in the same day then? The one on Primrose Hill and the one in the studio?
They were the same day.
Yeah.
They were the same day, and we did the ones in the studio first, and then I took them up to Primrose Hill. I'm not quite sure how we got away with it, really. Do you know, I don't remember a single conversation with any of them other than just, could you look a little bit more here, or Noel, could you look up into the light, or whatever it was. Otherwise, but you see, the thing is, for Oasis, that sort of challenging, menacing, don't fuck around with me look, that was something they really it appeared that was something they really wanted to perpetrate. And so, it was just finding this balance between this sort of petulant, childlike outburst and then trying to get them to actually work. Once they started working, they were terrific.
You think the moody looks and stuff like that helped the photos in a way?
Well, back in the 60s, people didn't want to be photographed smiling. I mean, we didn't want to smile. See, one of the things that was happening early on in the 60s was that we were trying to escape the smiley, glittery teeth, the frilly shirts, the ties. We were trying to get away from all of that showbiz stuff of the 50s and the very, very early 60s. And obviously there'd been forerunners, you know, Billy Fury had always been quite moody, but he also was very pretty and he smiled. So one of the easiest ways we could move away from that was to not dress up, you know, and to not smile. So that was sort of our position. That was where we were coming from. And with people like Jimi Hendrix, for instance, who was a very smiley person, you know, he was funny and he laughed a lot and we were giggling a lot throughout the session, and then having to say, no, pull yourself together sort of thing, you know, look mean and moody. And then you'd get a few pictures and then, I don't know, Noel Redding would say something and we'd all just break up laughing again. We had to compose ourselves. But the smiling pictures were never seen early on because that's not how the band wanted to present themselves, and that's not how people wanted to see them. So yes, the mean and moody thing is, in a perverse way, I think people think it's less self-conscious. you know, posing mean and moody is less self-conscious than posing smiley and happy. But of course, smiling is such an integral part of human beings. You know, when you meet somebody in the street, you smile, you generally smile. So I've always liked the smiley pictures. I've always tried to publish the smiley pictures. But back in the day, being mean and moody was what every young man wanted to be. They also thought it was sexy. I mean, that's also an important part of it.
You mentioned that you listened to Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights before you photographed her and stuff like that. Did you ever take into consideration the music when you were taking the photos, or was it just mainly the character and the looks?
No, the music did figure a lot. I mean, I wasn't always able to get access, but I always tried to listen to the music. I always tried to have the music playing in the studio. The music was very important, but what was more important was to try and understand what people were trying to express with their music and with their image. Because, you know, having the cloud background for George Harrison for Cloud 9, it's obvious, isn't it? But it makes a beautiful background, and doing it in the studio adds the slightly surreal element because you can control the lighting. So it has a quality to it that is unexpected. You're not sure whether it's outdoors or indoors, but it has a quality. But actually getting George, knowing how you want George to express himself within that framework, listening to the music, getting a feel for what the music is a big part of it. So I always tried to listen to the music. I always tried to understand the artist, even if I didn't like the music particularly. You know, I always tried to understand. I'm always in awe of musicians anyway, because I can't play anything. I just don't have a musical bone in my. I've got great rhythm. I can dance, but I can't sing. But so I'm in awe of musicians. I love being with musicians. I mean, being in a room of musicians just busking, jamming, hanging out is absolutely fantastic. I love it. And I mean, a couple of times I've even tried to play. I mean, the Stones got me on tambourine on a track at Olympic one night, and I lasted about 12 seconds. And Glyn Johns flicked the intercom and said, "Get the photographer out of there now." You know, I couldn't do it. But So yeah, I love music, and so yes, the music is very important, and trying to understand it, where it's coming from, where it's going, what sort of market they're aiming at, and trying to sort of get all of that in me, and then just hoping that it comes out in the way we take the photographs.
You mentioned before that when you went on tour with the Rolling Stones that you wasn't used to taking live photos of the band on stage, but you did Led Zeppelin. Were you more experienced then when you did the Led Zeppelin one?
Well, the Led Zeppelin, that's a bit of a cheat, really, because strictly speaking, they weren't on stage. They were doing a TV show. And I was the official photographer for the TV show, which was called Super Session or Super Show. And it was a very strange, it was a very, very strange concept. But there were a lot of wonderful artists. I got great pictures of Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, funny enough, both of which are in the new Gibson Garage Gallery exhibition, because they're both playing Gibsons, and they're very nice pictures. But the Led Zeppelin were the only band on that show who refused, who would only play as Led Zeppelin. Everybody else was playing, were mixing and matching. They were playing in a sort of super band type concept that you'd throw all these great musicians together and they would make wonderful music. That was the concept of the show. Led Zeppelin didn't want to do that. They were the only one who played as Led Zeppelin, and I got a few photographs of them. But live photography has never really been my forte. It's not been something that I've particularly enjoyed. I loved doing the Stones tour, but I never really wanted to do another tour after that. The only live photography that I did after that were on special occasions, like, you know, Slade live, Gary Moore live, a few others, you know, where they wanted me to shoot specifically for a cover. But I was never a photographer. In a way, for me, it's fortunate because I wouldn't have been very good at it. But I was never an editorial photographer. I never worked for the NME or the Melody Maker or Record Mirror as a regular photographer. I never had to go down and cover concerts on a day-to-day basis. I couldn't bear being in the pit with lots of other photographers. I mean, I can't think of anything more unpleasant, to be honest. Well, no, I can, but from a career point of view, I wouldn't want to do that. I mean, I understand from talking to friends of mine who do that there was a great camaraderie, but it's a special skill, and I just never had it, and I never liked to fight for my picture in that sense. So live photography is not something that's figured very, very highly, and it's not something that, it's not important to me, really. I mean, the photographs that I've taken are important, but for me, the essence of what I do and what I've always wanted to do is in my studio, is in a one-to-one relationship with the artist, working with them to create something that would go on a cover or a poster or an advert for their record that would help bring their music to a wider audience and to consolidate the image that they wanted to project. That's what I always wanted to do. I didn't feel I could do that as a photographing a concert, you know, that it was pot luck if you got a really great shot.
You only get a little bit of time at concerts as well, don't you? Like the first two songs or something.
Well, I mean, I've never been affected by that, but that's now. I think it's the first 2 or 3 songs, and then you're out. And as a lot of photographers told me, because a couple of years ago I did a television series. I was a producer on a television series called Icon Music Through the Lens, which was on Sky Arts. And so we interviewed about 70 photographers, a lot of whom their career was based photographing concerts. And as so many of them said, you know, what's the point of just photographing the first 2 songs? You know, the artist or the record company has decided arbitrarily that they don't want the artist to look too sweaty or and yet the essence of the performance culminates in the last two songs, the last three songs, not the first two. You know, so it's a ridiculous thing. But the whole music business is run in a completely different way now, and you know, artists, these big artists have their own official photographers who can cover all the rehearsals and all the shows from all the angles. And, you know, a few other photographers are allowed in, as you say, for the first two songs. And that's it. And then they're thrown out, literally.
Yeah. Would you, if you were starting again now, would you not take a career in music photography if you were starting from today?
Do you know something? I can't even put myself in that position. I mean, occasionally I get asked by young photographers, you know, for advice. And I would advise them to, you know, to take pictures, you know, take pictures of their local band, go to their local gigs, go to the pub on a Saturday night and photograph the band playing there. Just take pictures, because you just don't know where that's going to lead you. And if it leads you to the first two songs with Taylor Swift, then great. And if you're lucky, you'll get a wonderful photograph that will, you know, sell all around the world and make you lots of money. But I don't know, you know, it's never been, I can't imagine starting again. My feeling is, you know, thank goodness I don't have to. You know, what a relief it is. You know, I've done 60 years, thank you very much. You know, I can just enjoy having, you know, what I've done in those 60 years and share it with people like yourself and your listeners, and at my exhibitions, and, you know, in my books, and that's wonderful. I mean, that's marvelous. But I can't imagine starting again. That would be torturous.
You mentioned then a bit ago Slade. Were they the band you worked with the most after the after the Rolling Stones?
Sorry, who?
Slade.
Slade were. I work with Slade more than I've worked with any other band.
Oh, all
I
right,
think
yeah.
I think I've done over 40 sessions with Slade, and I think I've done nearly all their early album covers. Um, I love Slade.
Yeah.
Slade for me were one of the best, one of the greatest bands I've ever worked with. They were absolutely fantastic. And for me, they were the absolute epitome of everything that was great about glam rock and that whole 70s thing. They were fantastic band. And I loved their madness and their look and their craziness. And we just had such fun. And they were really good friends for years and years and years. And um, I loved them. And we always had fun, and we took loads of really good pictures. And, you know, we did some really quite special album covers, which certainly Slade fans uh, treasure. And I, whenever we post a Slade picture on Instagram, we always get more feedback from Slade fans than we get on any other post. Yes, more reaction. Slade fans are absolutely fantastic, and yeah, I love Slade. I've always loved Slade.
They're quite an underrated band, really, aren't they, when you think about it? They're a good band, but they're underrated.
Well, I suppose they were underrated. Yes, I suppose so. I think maybe music of the 70s was underrated. I mean, I can't get it into it in my head particularly, but I suppose Slade are underrated. I mean, they were hugely successful. I think it was tragic that they weren't able to break America as themselves, although several of their songs were covered and have been, you know, really important to American bands. I think that their musical talent and their songwriting talent um, was somewhat clouded by the image. And yet the image was crucial to the time. And
Yeah.
and the other thing about Slade is they made one of the best music films, music movies ever made. I mean, Slade in Flame is a fantastic movie. It's really, you know, it gets to the nitty gritty of a level of the music business, and it was a really great film. So yeah, I guess they're underrated. I suppose they are, but I don't know. I think their fans think they're the, you know, one of the greatest bands ever.
Yeah, yeah. What were Wham like to work with?
Well, I only worked with them once, and they were very nice. I mean, George was a little stagey. He had a very funny false smile that he put on that was odd. Um, but the cover, it was for Smash Hits magazine. It was a cover and a poster. And because George and Andrew had their fans were split. I think more for George than for Andrew, but nevertheless, they were split. And they, you know, both of them had huge followings. And so I designed a picture which you could turn around and have George top or Andrew top, depending upon your fancy. But they were very nice. I mean, you know, very easy. I mean, Andrew was friendlier than George. George was quite reserved, and as I said, had this funny, rather phony smile that he put on. And I don't know whether it was his way of saying I don't want to smile, you know. But they were fine. They were easy, responsive.
You mentioned that you got on well with Paul McCartney. You took photos of him as well when he was in the studio with Mick Jagger and Marion Faithfull.
Yes.
What?
Yes, I knew Paul socially a little bit, and he was always the most friendly and outgoing of the Beatles, as far as I was concerned. And he was always the most. One of his great charms was that he was always apparently interested in you. He had that fantastic ability to um, ask you about yourself, which is always very nice and rare. So he was a nice person to be with, nice person to chat with. I was quite friendly with Peter Asher, Jane Asher's brother at the time. So and Jane Asher and Paul were going out together, and Paul was living at the Asher's house. So you know there was a bit of crossover there, and I knew him through that. Then he stepped in to help Mick and Marianne when they were recording at Decca Studios, and I photographed him there. And then I photographed him and Linda later in Wings, because I did the program for Wings Over Japan, the ill-fated Wings Over Japan. So, you know, where he was busted at Tokyo and the tour was cancelled. They wouldn't let him in. And so thousands and thousands of copies of my program were burnt or chopped up or whatever they do to things. Yeah, so that was a shame, but it was a lovely experience working with them. They'd taken over a theatre in Eastbourne to rehearse, and they were all set up for a live show, and they were there for a couple of weeks rehearsing and getting the whole show worked out. And I went and spent a day with them there, and that was lovely. Very nice, very friendly, very laid back. You know, all the trappings of success without any of the pretentiousness or you know, the arrogance. Just a very nice, easygoing. Linda was very nice. It was the only time I ever really met her, and she was very nice. And considering she was such an accomplished photographer, she understood instantly that it was a bit intimidating for me, you know. But she broke the ice straight away and was sweet, very nice, very helpful.
Well, the last band I'll ask you about, 'cause we have been talking a while, I don't want to keep you too long.
No, it's lovely.
No, I've really enjoyed it. Yeah. Did you
Good.
say you had to be done for 1:30 though?
About 1:30, but we give or take a few minutes. So to carry on.
All right, thank you. Yeah, the Small Faces.
Ah, well, the Small Faces. I met and photographed the Small Faces before Ian McLagan joined the band, when Jimmy Winston was still in the band. and they were little mods, and particularly Steve. I mean, Steve was a little bloke with a mod haircut and a ridiculous John Stevens suit on or something. And we did a session. They were managed then by the infamous Don Arden, who I did a lot of work for and photographed a lot of bands for. And then they went to Immediate Records, and I did a lot of work with them at Immediate. And I loved them. I loved their music. I loved them. I got on really well with them. I did, I mean, one of the high points was the portraits I did for Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, which was a huge success, a huge album, a creative, a majestic creative tour de force. And I loved that. I loved working with them. It was the combination of the Small Faces and Immediate Records with Andrew Oldham sort of over seeing all of it was just such an incredibly creative time and great energy. And then I did the singles bag for Tin Soldier, which is a singles I've always loved. And then they had this relationship with Pat Arnold, P.P. Arnold, who I adored, and I'd photographed. I did all the P.P. Arnold covers for Immediate, and she's still a really close friend of mine. We work together whenever possible, and so the combination of the Small Faces and P.P. Arnold and that whole thing, it was very magical. There was a period, I guess, between, I suppose, 66 and 69 at Immediate, when it was just absolutely fantastic powerhouse of creativity and marvelous energy and great music. It was marvelous to be part of that.
There's a famous photo I wanted to ask you about, actually, the Yardbirds.
Oh yeah.
What was that shoot like?
Well, that was also rather a special shoot, because Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page in the band together, and that didn't last a long time. So I think my shoot was to photograph them all together for the first time. I think it was the sort of official pictures that the band used at that moment. And I shot them in the studio and outside. And when we were outside, I was photographing them in a place called Ormond Yard, which was a cobbled yard that went up to Duke Street, St. James, I think. And I had them in the cliched arrowhead composition, which is a classic that you do with a band of 5 people, with the singer in the front and then 2 and 2. And out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that there was a guy walking across at the top of the street wearing a bowler hat with a rolled umbrella. And he epitomized the establishment at that moment. And I managed to get a photograph of him where he's framed exactly between Keith Relf, the singer's, legs. And it was just one of those things. And then he went. And I can't remember whether the band used it or whether we even saw it for what it was, because seeing people in bowler hats was a daily thing. A lot of people wore bowler hats still in London in the mid-60s. So it wasn't, I don't know whether anybody really noticed it or picked it out as something. But when I started showing my work in exhibitions and doing books, I picked it out and started showing it, because not only was there this guy with the bowler hat who I'd seen, but also who I hadn't seen. There was a girl in a miniskirt and a chap delivering beer to the pub opposite. And in that one picture, you've got the band representing rebellious youth, music, energy. And then between his legs, you've got the establishment, bowler hat and rolled umbrella. And then you've got the mini-skirted girl swinging London, and you've got the working class hero delivering beer, all in one picture.
Yeah,
And I thought,
yeah.
that was great. So it was one of those pictures that you discover again. But I don't think any of us, I don't remember any of us being conscious of all of that at the time that we did it. And as far as the band was concerned, they were great. I mean, I knew Jimmy Page a bit. I'd never met any of the others. I knew Jimmy because Jimmy had been a session man for a long time, and he was on a lot of sessions that Andrew Oldham did, and a lot of the immediate singles have Jimmy on guitar. I knew Jimmy, and they were just incredibly easy to work with. All the pictures are rather cliched, the poses, the compositions are rather cliched, but they all work. And it was a good, productive session. I enjoyed it.
Have you had any other shoots where something accidental has happened in the background and you've noticed in the image afterwards?
That's a good question. Nothing really springs to mind. I think that I tell you one session which you've made me think about, and that is often what you plan. You go into a session with a plan. And one shoot that I had a very specific plan that we'd worked out was with a band called the Tourists, which was the forerunner of Eurythmics. And the Tourists had a big hit with a Dusty Springfield song, the title of which escapes me. And we were doing an album sleeve for them, and it was going to be called Reality Effects. And I had come up with this concept with them, with Annie and Dave, of having building a room in the studio, an ordinary, very simple sort of sitting room with a dining table, a TV, fireplace, windows, all that. But we painted everything white. Everything was painted white. The fruit in a bowl was painted white. The TV was painted white. Everything was white. And the band wore 5 individual costumes that were all white and different from each other. So Dave was a chef, Annie was a bride, one of them was a sort of circus performer, another one was in overalls, the other one I think was in a straitjacket. I can't remember. And the idea was I was going to photograph it from above. So I had a big setup, a rostrum set up with my camera pointing directly down onto this. The band was sitting in armchairs, and I gave them colored paint. And I said to them, right, so we're going to colorize this white room like painting with numbers. That was the sort of inspiration. That was the concept. Well, so I'm up lying on my tummy, looking down at this. They're all sitting there around waiting for me to say, I've done all my tests. I've got my exposures worked out. It's ready to go, start painting. Well, what I didn't know was that 2 of the band had just dropped acid, and it kicked in at the moment, and they just threw the fucking paint everywhere. They didn't give a shit about where it went. They just ran at each other all over the place. And I'm up there. Fortunately, they didn't throw it up at me. And I'm just shooting away, bang, 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 thinking, oh my God, the concept has gone to shit, it's all a disaster. And then I would stop them for a minute. I managed to scream, right, hold it there and look up. And they'd all look up. And then bang, 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 throw. And finally it got to a point where there was so much paint on the dining table that one of the guys who'd taken acid was face down on the table, and he was covered in so much paint that he was virtually invisible. You had to search for him, and Annie was splattered and everybody was covered. There was no sense to it. It was just complete madness. But the point of the story, and from what you were saying, was that it was much better than the concept. It was much better than I thought it could be. It was like a Jackson Pollock painting, you know. It was really unique and special. And so, although I don't think the band set out to do that, and certainly in my conversations with Annie and Dave subsequently, and there's a funny little spin-off story which I will tell you before we end, but they didn't know that was going to happen, but they just piled in, and it was great. It was really great. The studio was a terrible mess, but it was great. And so cut to the first Eurythmics session, which I suppose was, I don't know, 12 months, 14 months later. And they've come to the studio, and it's all hugs and kisses. I've become very close with Annie and Dave, and we worked together a lot, and it was really lovely. And Annie went to the bathroom, and she came out, she was laughing. I said, "What's so funny?" She said, "There are still the stains on the wall from when we were washing off the paint from a year ago." And there were.
Well, thank you for that. I've really enjoyed that. Really insightful and entertaining.
Oh, Ethan, you've broken up again, but thank you. I think I understood what you said.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Is there anything you want to promote, or your social medias and your prints, anything like that?
Yeah, well, I'd love you to promote the social media, the Instagram in particular, but we're on Facebook and Twitter. Yeah, I'd like to mention, I mean, the book again. I'd love to mention the book. I'll send you, it's not for sale yet, but it will be from March the 28th. You can pre-order it on Amazon now. And also the exhibition at the Gibson Garage Gallery. Now, Gibson Garage Gallery is a huge revamp of the Gibson guitar showroom. And they're calling these revamps Gibson Garage. There's one in Nashville, which is a huge success, and they're trying to repeat that in London. And I'm very excited because they've created a gallery as part of it, and I'm the first photographer to be featured in the gallery. So there's about 35 of my photographs up there. It'll be running from March the 24th for 3 months. And they're in East Castle Street, which is 1 block off Oxford Circus. And so I love people to go there because it's a fantastic location. And the book, which is coming out on March the 28th.
Yeah, I'll definitely pre-order that. Yeah, it looks good.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, am I okay to use your photos in my video that we're talking about? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. What I think you should do is when you've got your edit, or when you know it's just contact me again, and I'll bash you up a few photographs.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and also, am I okay to use it on my Instagram story if I tag you in it, just to promote the episode?
If you tag us, yeah, if you tag us and link us and do whatever they do, that's fine.
All right, thank you. Yeah, just thought
and let me know. Give me a link to the podcast and whatever you put together for your Instagram. Give that to me, and I'll pass that on to the people who do my social media.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too, Ethan. It was lovely chatting to you. Good fun.
Thank you. See you in a bit then.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.